Alex O'Connor says that Jesus never claimed to be God in our earlier Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I know Alex will never see this, but if anybody knows him, please send him this, because I'm astounded. He's a smart guy, but if he truly believes what he says in this clip I'm about to play, he has not engaged with the data at all. And I'd love to show him briefly. In fact, I have a free book on this subject, Jesus is God. Links are in my YouTube page, and I'll ship him a free copy if anybody knows how I can get that to him. But let's listen to his video. It's about 50 seconds, and then I'll give a few responses.
First, Wes says that Jesus was audaciously going around claiming to be God himself. I don't think that's true. Nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke does Jesus actually claim to be God in his own words. At best, it's just in John's Gospel that divine claims begin to appear. I and the Father are one. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Before Abraham was, ego eimi. I actually still don't think even these count, and we'll explain why in another video, but let's just say that they do. Even if this was Jesus explicitly claiming to be God, don't you think it's a bit suspicious that these claims only show up in our latest gospel? If Jesus was known to be walking around claiming explicitly to be God himself, did the other 3 gospel authors just not think this was relevant? A minor, unimportant detail not worth including?
So I hear that, and I just have to wonder if he's ever seriously engaged with a study of any of those other Gospels. And I had the privilege of really digging deep into Mark a few years ago, and I was just astounded by what Mark was actually claiming. I think Mark's Christology is higher than John's. I am convinced that Mark is actually the clearest picture of the deity of Christ. And I just want to give you four examples. There's plenty more. But before I give you those 4 examples, I'm going to give an illustration. When Avengers Endgame was in theaters, people began to upload scenes from the end of the movie. And there were scenes where everyone was cheering. And everyone was cheering when Sam Wilson said these 3 words, "On your left." Now, if you don't know the earlier movies, you don't quite understand what that means. I mean, you know it's something, but you're not sure exactly. To those of us who are familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that is a canonical line from Captain America Winter Soldier. And so when Sam Wilson said it, we all knew what that meant. Just as Cap ran by Falcon in Winter Soldier, we knew that meant Falcon and the rest of the Avengers were coming. So everyone erupts, even though nobody said, "Hey, we're all coming back." "On your left" was enough to communicate to those familiar with the Marvel canon, they're all coming. And I tell you that to say, Jesus never had to say the words, "I am God," because the recipients of the Gospels knew their Old Testament well enough so that when they heard similar callbacks, they were able to connect the dots. This is God in flesh. They didn't need to be told, "I am God." They needed to be told some of the things we're going to see here, that when he speaks, the waters obey. When he splits bread from his hands, he's doing exactly what Yahweh did from heaven from the Old Testament. The Gospels don't have to say Jesus is God. They have to say what God did and said in the Old Testament for them to pick up and go, just as Falcon said, "On your left," and everyone knew what that meant. The New Testament writers are saying, here's Jesus' identity. Because they knew God in the Old Testament, they knew who he was claiming to be. I want to give you 4 examples. If you go with me to Mark chapter 1, in fact, I've got it right here. And Mark opens his gospel with a dual citation. It's really a citation from 3 different passages he blends together. One of those passages, and you'll see it here in the references, is Malachi 3 verse 1. And I want you to see what Malachi 3 verse 1 is saying, so that you can understand how Mark is opening his gospel. So we'll go to Malachi 3 verse 1. And Malachi is really God is speaking through Malachi. You know this is God because here you see how it's in all caps. This is Yahweh speaking. He is coming, says Yahweh, the Lord of hosts. So God is speaking, and he's declaring a day when he is going to come to Israel. And before he comes to Israel, he's going to send a messenger, right? It says, "Behold, I send my messenger, He will prepare the way before me. So the messenger's going to come, then Yahweh's going to come. And the Lord, Adon, whom you will seek, will suddenly come to his temple. Well, who has the temple? Yahweh. This is Yahweh's temple. And so what this is saying is a messenger is going to come, prepare the way, and then God is going to follow. So what is Mark doing? Well, Mark quotes this, "Behold, I send my messenger before your face." So he's quoting Malachi, where God has said, my messenger is going to come, then me. John appears. Okay, that's the messenger. We all know that. That's not a disputed thing. That is the messenger. Where's God? Jesus comes next. And what's the main point of conflict in Mark's gospel? It's when he enters the temple complex and he judges the temple, right? I mean, he does exactly what God said he was going to do. So Malachi 3, my messenger is going to come, then I'm going to come and I'm going to judge my temple. Now John the messenger shows up as the messenger, and who comes next? Jesus. He comes, and what does he do? He marches straight to Jerusalem in the center of the gospel, and he judges the temple. And Mark is showing us this is God in flesh. So before we can even get into the narrative, Mark is showing you the texts that speak and flavor how we should interpret what's happening. Mark is saying the messenger is going to come, then God's going to come. John the Baptist comes, and now God in flesh comes. I smile because John the Messenger is a friend of mine on TikTok, and I can't ever stop saying his name when I speak of John the Baptist now. So that's one example. The next example is in Mark chapter 2. And if you go down, you have this kind of strange conflict where Jesus is questioned because his disciples don't fast, right? John's disciples, the Pharisees, were fasting. So people came to Jesus and said, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast? Now remember, fasting is it's devotion to God. It's abstaining from food and other comforts for the purpose of seeking the Lord. And so Jesus gives an answer for why they don't fast. And Jesus says to them, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? Now, he's not giving a lesson in social etiquette. He's not saying, hey, there's a wedding going on, so we're not going to fast right now, like we're going to eat. That's what he's saying, but that's not what he's saying. Why does he call himself the bridegroom? What's the significance of that? He's not just an etiquette teacher. Well, the significance of that is who God has revealed himself to be in the Old Testament. So you go to Hosea 2, verse 19. Hosea is the famous prophet who had to marry a prostitute, and his marriage was to be a picture of God's covenant with Israel. As Hosea was faithful to his bride, Yahweh has been faithful to Israel. But as Hosea's wife plays the prostitute, Israel has been a prostitute to the Lord. But what does God promise through Hosea? Well, he says in chapter 2, verse 19, I'll betroth you to me forever. I'm going to marry you. I'll betroth you to me in righteousness and justice, in steadfast love and mercy. I'll betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. And in that day I'll answer, declares the Lord. I'll answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth. The earth shall answer the grain, the wine, the oil. They shall answer Jezreel, and I'll sow her for myself in the land. I will have mercy on no mercy, and I will say to not my people, you are my people, and he shall say, you are my God. And what the Lord is saying is he's proposing, I'm going to wed myself to you. And this isn't just Hosea. This is Isaiah 62 as well, in verse 4 to 5. He says, speaking of the second Exodus that's going to come, you shall no more be termed forsaken. You shall no more be termed desolate, but you shall be called, my delight is in her, and your land married, for the Lord delights in you. your land shall be married. As a young man marries a young woman, so shall your sons marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. In other words, in the Old Testament, Yahweh has declared himself to be Israel's bridegroom. So we get to Mark chapter 2, and the Pharisees and the disciples of John are wondering, like, why are we seeking God this way, and your disciples aren't seeking God? And what does Jesus say? How can they fast when the bridegroom's here? You see what he's saying? How can you fast in devotion to the Lord when God is right in front of you? And that's what he's saying. I'm the bridegroom. There's going to be a time where I'm not going to be here, and they'll fast because he's going to be crucified and he's going to ascend. But by calling himself the bridegroom, he's saying, I am the one here to wed myself to my people forever. That's what he's saying. He's calling himself the Lord there. Probably one of the most familiar, most obvious points is in Mark chapter 3, where Jesus, I think it's Mark 4, not 3. Yeah, Mark 4. So you have here in Mark 4, Jesus calming the storm. Now, before we look at that, think about the Old Testament for a moment. Throughout the Old Testament, the most frequent demonstration of God's power is what he does with water. Okay, this isn't just a small motif. This is a massive motif throughout the Old Testament. Genesis 1. One of the problems at the very beginning is that the waters are everywhere. What does it say? The Spirit hovers over the water. And the point is, what is treacherous to man, in the beginning, God demonstrates his power because the waters are no match. He just does whatever he wants with them. He separates them. He puts them wherever he wants. Okay, it's demonstrating God's sovereignty over water. You get to Genesis 7. The first major judgment on the whole world is, of course, the commanding of the flood waters. The first Exodus is the commanding of the Red Sea. The wind that the Lord commands holds the Red Sea in place so that the people can pass through. And then, of course, once they're through, the Lord causes the waters to crash down upon Pharaoh and his army. Think of the book of Judges, and the armies of Sisera are destroyed by a river. I think it's the river Kishon, I believe. And again, it's the Lord summoning water to do whatever he wills. You think of Psalm 29. I mean, I'll just show you. Psalm 29 is a meditation of God's power over a storm. And so you have verse 3, David is watching a storm off in the distance come up over the northern mountains down as it moves down into the southern wilderness. And he's just reflecting on how this storm, as powerful as it is on a leash. And you can see what the leash is. Verse 3, the voice of the Lord is over the waters. Verse 4, the voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The voice of the Lord flashes. So you got thunder and lightning. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The voice of the Lord, verse 10, the Lord sits enthroned over the flood. Israel's God could do whatever he wanted with water. Psalm 77. He's meditating on God's power, and he realizes that the Lord was with him all through the waters. The Lord chose to use water as the way of deliverance, which to the ancient world was a grave because you couldn't navigate the seas. They were too treacherous. You typically went there and often died. And so he's going, how in the world did God do this? He chose to use the sea. That doesn't make sense. Well, it does, because he reigns over it. One of the greatest Psalms, Psalm 107, is speaking of a second Exodus, that last day when the Lord's going to save his people. And what you have in Psalm 107 is a story about some people who are lost at sea. Verse 23, some of these lost people went down to the sea in ships, business on great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. He commanded and raised the stormy wind. He commanded the wind, lifted the waves of the sea. They mounted up, so the waves carried them real high. They went down to the depths, searched all over. The men's courage melted away. They reeled, staggered, drunken men. They cried to the Lord. He made the storm be still. And this is just, there's just so many texts about God's sovereign power over water and how he commands to do it. So you go back to Mark 4. And Mark is just so strategic in helping us to make the connection, because I think Mark would be baffled to hear anyone go, well, he didn't present Jesus as God. Well, look at what he says. Mark 4, verse 37, a great windstorm arose. Waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling, just like Psalm 107. Jesus is in the stern, asleep on the cushion. They woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing? They're crying to him, just as the sailors did in Psalm 107 to God. He woke, he rebuked or commanded the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. The wind ceased. There was a great calm. He said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? That too is a claim to deity. He's saying faith in me, which otherwise should have been faith in God, but because those are the same, he has no problem asking this. They were filled with great fear and said to one another, and listen to the question, and look at what Mark's doing as a narrative writer. Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Mark is taking us literally to the waters to drink. And he's saying, you guys know who commands the waters throughout the Old Testament. So his characters say, who is this? Who is this that the wind and sea obey him? Duh. It's obvious, unless you refuse to see the connections. You can try to hijack Mark and put him in some other context, but Mark is writing to people who had heard the Old Testament. He's clearly constantly using Old Testament references and allusions. He is making it clear that the God of the Old Testament is now here in flesh, commanding the waters however he will. But I want to catch, Alex makes this statement that only John uses the ego eimi statement, which again is just factually incorrect. And there's not enough time for us to spend in Mark chapter 6, because Mark 6 alone is just filled with countless allusions to the Old Testament to show you Jesus is God in flesh. Maybe just to give you a few examples. So in the beginning of Mark 6, we're looking at Herod. And Herod, of course, it begins a dialogue about Jesus' identity, because all throughout Mark is trying to get us to ask the question, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? And he's constantly showing us that he's God in flesh. So you have this scene at Herod's birthday where John the Baptist is beheaded, and then immediately following that scene, you have Jesus with his 12 walking into a wilderness. It's a parallel to Israel fleeing Pharaoh and his palace, and they were walking straight into the wilderness in the first Exodus. Now Mark is showing us, here's Jesus with his 12 disciples, who are reconstituted 12 tribes, and they have a crowd with them, an impossible amount to feed. And of course, Mark picks up on the parallels between God as shepherd in the Old Testament and Jesus, as Jesus looks at them with compassion. This is how God reveals himself over and over in the Old Testament, and he has compassion on them because they are sheep without a shepherd. The point is, Jesus is the shepherd. He is, I think it's Psalm 80 that reveals Yahweh as the shepherd of Israel. Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. So here's Jesus, the shepherd, amidst his people. And just like in the Old Testament, where Yahweh rains bread down from heaven, Jesus does not summon bread from heaven. He summons it from his own hands. It breaks and multiplies from his own hands. Again, Mark is drawing our attention. He's the source of the miracle. He's not looking for God in heaven to bring the bread down. He is the source from which the miracle happens. Again, that's besides the point. That's not even where I wanted to go. But it's in this context of a clear second Exodus. Jesus is leading these people away from a pagan ruler. He's feeding them bread out in the wilderness, an impossible number to feed. And now we have Jesus passing by his disciples. You have it right here, Mark 6, verse 48. His disciples are at sea. He meant to pass them by. In the Greek Old Testament, in the Septuagint, this verb pass by here is the exact same verb used when God's glory passes by Moses and when God's glory passes by Elijah. Remember Elijah, there was wind. God was not in the wind, so the wind ceases. God was there. Here you have Jesus, verse 48. Like God in the Old Testament, he meant to pass his disciples by, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him, were terrified. And look at what he says. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, this is ego eimi." He says, "I am. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And this reference here, I imagine, is going to say Isaiah 41, verse 10, because it doesn't say it. Well, that's a shame. But this is nearly word for word what God promises in Isaiah 41, verse 10. See it, Isaiah 41, 10. "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God." And in the Greek, I know this was originally Hebrew, but in the Greek Septuagint, which is what the New Testament writers are typically quoting, this is nearly word for word here. And Jesus is taking this statement from Yahweh, and when his disciples are afraid, what does he say? Well, he doesn't say, "Take heart, God is with you, do not be afraid." Jesus says, "Take heart, be courageous. I am. Don't fear." Jesus is claiming to be God. He's revealing himself to be God. There are countless other examples. Again, I've got them here in this book. Would be happy to send it anywhere. It's a free PDF as well. And it's just so apparent that Alex has either deliberately not looked at these texts, or he's just misrepresenting them. I mean, it couldn't be more obvious. So I hope he'll see this. I hope somebody else will share with him what he's saying is just not at all true, not at all a representation of what the Gospels portray.